The opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of War, or the U.S. government.
Yeah, sometimes they call that the disaster after the disaster, right? And I'm going to pick on Indo-Pacific for a while. Back then, PACOM. So in 2013, Typhoon Haiyan went through the Philippines. I was the J9. I'm watching this from the outside. I hadn't moved to CFE yet. And God bless them, right? Somebody said, hey, we're going to do a clothing drive, right? So they're going to bring boxes in, they're going to collect clothing, and they're going to send it to Tacloban, or they're going to send it to someplace else in the Philippines, right? That's like the worst thing imaginable that you can do. But they did it. They did it because their heart was pure, right? These people are going to need clothes. It's like, yeah, but they don't need winter jackets and ski boots because that's what people in Hawaii get rid of, right? They don't get rid of like kids' diapers, right? And things like that. So there becomes that disaster after disaster is one thing, but it really does become, and that's, I guess, the benefit of being a logistician growing up, is that understanding that part of the humanitarian, environment was super easy for me. I mean, that was like second nature, because I had a lifetime of war planning for logistics.
Aloha, and welcome to Dialogue, where conversations shape security. In the Indo-Pacific, security doesn't always collapse under fire. Sometimes it collapses under water, or wind, or the ground itself. A single storm, a fault line shifting, or a wall of water, and decades of development can vanish in a matter of hours. When that happens, the world doesn't just measure the damage, it watches who responds, how they coordinate, and whether institutions hold or fail under pressure. Disaster response isn't charity, it's a stress test of leadership, governance, and partnerships, and one of the clearest indicators of regional stability. I'm James Minnick, Colonel United States Army retired and professor here at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii. This is episode 53, Strategy in the Storm, a dialogue with Joe Martin. Joe is the director of the Center for Excellence in Disaster Management and Humanitarian Assistance, based here in Hawaii, where military capability and humanitarian action meet, and coordination matters as much as capacity. Joe Martin, welcome to Dialogue.
Hey, thanks a lot, James. I appreciate it.
Super glad to have you down here. Been working with your team to get you down here, and I know you had to extricate yourself from beautiful Ford Island, and make that drive. But we're glad to have you.
Well, thank you so much. It's our relationship with APCSS goes back, a long way. We're kind of born around the same time, and I'm glad to finally have the chance, the opportunity to do this.
No, we were. In fact, I think there's maybe a year that separates us, and you celebrated your 30th recently, but a year before we did, and we did ours last year, and so. Happy anniversary to the center there. You've been out there a while. 12 years is what I'm tracking. And so, before we get into talking about institutions and strategy and stuff, I just kind of want to talk a little bit about you. And I know that you're a retired Air Force colonel. In fact, I'm certain that you and I found ourselves, even though if we didn't know it, in similar places at similar times. I know you were in Korea, and so was I. I know you did Afghanistan, and so did I, and you did many places. I want you to talk a little bit about that, but I'm kind of curious about this, what led you to this intersection of your military operations and humanitarian response? Tell us your story.
Sure, but you only gave me an hour, so.
Fair enough.
So a reasonable description is, I entered the Air Force in the 80s, had a chance to do sort of all the typical Air Force logistics officer things. And then at a certain point in time, you get on sort of the command track to do stuff. You get promoted a few times, and then much sooner than you realize, you find yourself a colonel in the United States Air Force and afforded opportunities to do some unique things. So I was deployed as the Mission Support Group Commander at Ali Al Salim Air Base in Kuwait, 2012 to 2013. And when I came back to PACOM.
I know that place well.
Yeah. So, and it was when I was there that I had done joint assignments before and been overseas a bunch of times. But it really was at Indo-PACOM that I sort of just noted sort of the broad nature of the theater and the different interactions with folks, and then was afforded a very unique opportunity to move from being the J9, the Director of Outreach, down to being the director at the Center for Excellence in 2014. It was a very short notice move, shall we say, rather abrupt change in leadership, which brought its own exciting challenges to it. And then 2 years later, I was able to stay on as the civilian director. My background as a logistics officer was surprisingly useful in understanding sort of the dynamics associated with disaster response preparedness. And then I think my leadership experience after having been a colonel for 9 years at that time really gave me a chance to broaden the way that I think about things, which I think has led to at least an opportunity to stay there for the last 10 years now, almost 10 years now as a civilian. So
that's cool. There's still a bit of a gap, though, between doing military operations and doing humanitarian assistance. I mean, you woke up one day, or maybe you didn't. Maybe they just said, Joe, go do this thing. But I imagine you kind of thought, I want to spend my time doing this. Was there a time?
So that's a great question, James, because you talk to anybody, right? Like, how did you get to where you are? Everybody's path is different. Since this is live, I'll be honest and try and restrain myself in aspects, but the previous director of the center was relieved.
Yep.
I was not in the humanitarian space at all in my past. And basically it was, hey Joe, clean out your desk, you're gonna be the director starting tomorrow. I went into an organization, so this goes to sort of the dynamic change things that I didn't know a whole lot about, into really what was a space that I didn't have a lot of awareness about either, until I started doing it. And then I realized that, as I alluded to a second ago, the things that I had done as a logistician really played into the skill sets and the operations and things that the humanitarian community gets involved in. And because I was still in uniform at the time, I was able to bridge that gap, often referred to as a civil military gap. You can define that 100 different ways.
Right.
But in my case, it was, how do I take my military experience and then bring that into this new community where, and I say this jokingly and yet not, I spent 27 years in the Air Force where your mission in life was to kill people and break things.
That's right.
Right? And now you get an opportunity to lead an organization whose mission statement has, save lives and alleviate suffering in it.
That's right.
How do you, it was always an interesting dynamic, but the skill sets that I brought with me, I would say probably made that transition a little bit easier, because it wasn't something that I grew up doing. At least I look back and there were certainly lots of humanitarian things that I did. We can talk about those if you want. But it wasn't a core background in it until I really got into the job.
Well, you're the right guy to sit down and talk about CFE, because the Center for Excellence of Disaster Management and Humanitarian Assistance, there's some people that are watching this that know about this.
Right.
And then there's another group of people that were interested in what we're going to talk about, but they may not understand the organization that well. And like you mentioned, in '94, CFE stood up, and if I've got the story right, it stood up as a result, or in part anyway, with Hurricane Iniki that hit the Hawaiian Islands in '92, Category 4, I guess, and did tremendous damage. I think it was the same year that it hit another hurricane hit the mainland, and Hurricane Andrew, and we just had significant devastation and destruction that went on. They said, we need to have a response area here. And so when we think about this, so away from these active disasters, what are you or even the center deliberately trying to change when you think about people, institutions, or relationships, so that we ensure that response really does matter?
Right. So you're accurate. Hurricane Iniki plus the disasters on the mainland and a lot of stuff in Southeast Asia really sort of led Senator Inouye to say, hey, we need to create some of these capacities, right? So you guys were birthed, we were birthed, with our mission being, how do you look at the foreign humanitarian assistance? So to understand a little bit about what we do, right? We are a Department of Defense organization. I'm a DoD civilian. I work for Indo-Pacific. My direct boss is Admiral Paparo, right? So I'm not, and never do I pretend to be, a humanitarian, right? Because I'm not. I don't meet the criteria to be a humanitarian on almost any level. right? We're not neutral, we're not independent, right? So that's not, but we're in the humanitarian space, right? And we're in a part in the Pacific in particular, as part of the humanitarian community, because there are so many disasters and there are so many institutions and organizations involved and response capacities. You know, you couched it pretty well, which is how do you look at all of those enterprises together and be a part of it, right? So how does CFE fit into this? Well, we're all civilians. Probably 2/3 of us are former military in some form or fashion. As I mentioned, I'm a career logistics officer, but we have public affairs officers. We have people who have never been in the military. You know, guys from UN folks. I got one of the guys that works for me is a civilian. I literally spent 7 years in Afghanistan as a civilian, working for the State Department and other organizations. So it's just a broad stroke of expertise that then we try to insert ourselves into some of those, maybe opportunities is a good word, maybe gaps, seams, you know, kind of call them whatever you want, but it's how can we take this unique DoD capacity, because we're the only one like us in the Department of Defense, right? How do we take this unique capacity and bring it to bear, bring it to assistance with either foreign militaries, if they want to enhance their capacity to respond to disasters, foreign civilian organizations, because we're actually authorized by Congress to work with civilian organizations, so I'm not restricted in that aspect, U.S. military and U.S. civilian organizations. So we kind of work with everybody in the space in which they are, I don't want to say most in need, because that's not necessarily true, but most where our expertise fits, right? So if you want to talk about civil military coordination in disasters, or how do you bring U.S. military assets to bear to provide assistance to a country, how do you help a country for its civilian agencies or military to get better at disasters? Those are, I'd say, a few of the things that we do on I would say a regular basis, but we do about 100 events a year with a team of about 35 people.
That's busy.
Our activity report to the commander is never empty, that's for sure.
So you're talking about training, education, exercises, dialogues, things like this?
Right. Yeah, so for example, like next week, we're going to be teaching our Humanitarian Assistance Response training course here in Hawaii to military forces, but that's the foundation for that course is taught all over the world. We teach at teach basically the same content at the Philippine Command and Staff College a couple times a year. We also teach at Quantico, and then that becomes a foundation for how do we support big exercises, right? So about 2 weeks from now, or next week, I depart, heading towards Cobra Gold, so a big exercise with Thailand. We work with DDPM, which is their version of FEMA. If you're familiar with FEMA, if you're in other countries, it's their National Disaster Management Organization. But we also work with the Royal Thai Armed Forces in doing humanitarian assistance training so that in that scenario, people are good at it, but then also for real, they're good at it, because that goes to the exercise piece and the training piece. And then we do a lot of work in research and product development as well.
I want to pull on what you were just talking about, partnerships. You just named several of them. And so without a doubt, I mean, disasters, they reveal whether partnerships are real or they're rhetorical.
Right.
That's where the rubber meets the road. So what separates partnerships then that hold together under pressure from such a struggle? What separates them from those that don't?
It's a great question, because it's almost like, is it talk or go, right?
Yeah.
Do you talk a good game or do you actually play a good game, right? And there are relationships across probably anybody's world, you know, certainly the humanitarian space in particular. And somebody will talk a good game, but when it really comes down to it, you know, they don't have as much capacity as they talk about or otherwise. And one of the things that I sort of pride myself on at CFE is that I have a tendency not, and this is a unique event for me to be on camera, so I have a tendency to not talk about what we're going to do. I talk about what we do or what we did, because it's production based. It's actually making deliverables. It's really providing an improvement to a military organization, a civilian organization, a research project, a published document. It's really producing something of value. And I think that my partners that do that are hugely valuable. I'll give you an example. So in the Southeast Asia, right? So Singapore, there's an organization called the Regional Humanitarian Coordination Center.
Yes, there is.
It's one of the international humanitarian community, and I'll put that in quotation marks because that can be defined 100 different ways. Yeah. It's part of that community in Southeast Asia and other places in which the Singapore Armed Forces have a capacity, right? Well, this year we partnered with our HCC on several projects, but one in particular was our disaster reference handbook with Singapore, right? So we have 35 of these books, I think, covers every country in the Pacific, including all the Pacific Islands, available on our website, as you guys know. But the Singapore one, they actually said, hey, we want to co-author this with you. So we published our first co-authored book with Singapore this year, right? Which does a couple things, right? Gives them ownership of the product. It reduces the amount of work that I have to do, so now I can go do other additional work. And so that's an active partner doing real things, tangible benefits. And most of them are like that.
Yeah.
You know?
And I have no doubt but that as these 100 events that you're participating in and bringing together participants from the nations in the region and stuff, that you are building networks where people know each other, trust each other, right, so that when the crisis happens, they know they can pick up the phone and talk to somebody that they know. Is that fair?
Yeah. So interesting you said that because like I spent 27 years in the military. In that time, I had 17 assignments. So I did from 1995 to 2015. Literally, I moved every 1 or 2 years, right? Which is a slightly atypical military career, but not all that far off. So to be in an organization for the last 11 years, right, in which you meet the same people or you meet their replacement and you actually build those relationships. There's a quote that I copied from a UN guy, right? The right place to exchange business cards is not at the scene of a disaster, right? You need to have met these people before. And I can, with some level of confidence, say that I know most of the disaster managers and disaster planners in the Pacific. And it does, because if you want to make a difference and if you want to connect somebody that maybe doesn't know someone, but they both trust you, that helps a lot. We're trying to do a lot of work in a lot of places, trying to take some of our efforts, maybe less bilateral, more multilateral. How do you get people who may not have ever worked together to engage and cooperate and produce great things? Well, sometimes because they both know you. And I'm not saying, me specifically, but our relationships with the UN guys and the Red Cross and Red Crescent guys and the World Food Program, I mean, all of those enterprises, are part of this community. And when you know them, right? So.
No, and there at the end you're talking about how you bring in a lot of the international organizations and stuff, which help connect these disaster managers with real capacity providers. Yeah, that's powerful. That's powerful. So let's pull then a little bit talking about disasters, and let's start talking about complex disasters.
Sure.
So in 2024, the Egna landslide in Papua New Guinea. Mm-hmm. Responders face both natural disasters and security challenges, and this can be typical in a complex disaster, which no doubt you have experience in. So how do you train leaders then to think ahead when these disasters unfold in areas of instability and violence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if I went back, like I said, I got to the center in 14, around 2016, we started talking about the differences in humanitarian assistance in conflict or in a complex and more complex environment. It took a long time, probably in 2018 or 19 or so, we actually started working on it. We actually produced a course now, which is the Heart for Conflict.
Heart C.
Heart C.
You've got another Heart.
We have Heart D, Heart Disasters, and Heart Conflict.
Nice.
And basically, it then tries to take into account those other factors and planning considerations. Now, primarily, the lessons learned and the content of that is based on places like Afghanistan, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and others, in which there is an active armed conflict going on, and yet there are humanitarian components to it and activities that, in this case, the engaged military, and we teach it at First Corps, we teach it to 3rd MEB or 3 MEF, pretty much every year, is these are the humanitarian considerations in an active conflict. People that you may be able to play nicely with the United Nations in a natural disaster in Thailand. Well, you're not going to be able to do that on the ground in a conflict because they have to maintain a certain distance. How do you function in that space? I think some of those lessons, like in the case of Papua New Guinea and others, when the natural disaster either could lead to conflict based on the local conditions, or in some cases, the natural disaster itself could become a precursor for conflict, right? And not throwing, I'm not afraid to talk about, the elephant in the room, or, but the fact is that if something were to happen in Taiwan, right, and in a natural disaster space, that literally could become a precursor for an event. And I'm not the only person who talks about that. We teach courses and run operations and activities in Taiwan, right? And those activities and those training events, they actually ask us, can you bring these scenarios in, because we need to think about it. I mean, it kind of goes to, if you don't practice something, right, you're going to be surprised by everything, right? So it's like, hey, can we practice this? It may or may not happen, right? And so in the case of Papua New Guinea, for example, we do training programs at the provincial level. Why? Because that's how they manage disasters. Well, each province in Papua New Guinea has its own security issues that are driven by things that are well beyond the control of the classes that I teach.
Yeah, I mean, so just if we pull down what you're saying here, right, I'm thinking about in EGNA, for example, if you've got tribal areas, say this is our area and there's a checkpoint that's put in there and you're trying to get through there because you're trying to provide, or it's complex because the infrastructure has been significantly compromised in different ways. Then you get to a point like that, and they say, "Oh, you got to stop here," and you ask yourself, "I got a mission on the other side. How do I get through? What do we do?"
So there's two pieces to that, and there's several other examples that we can bring up.
We could.
So one is it does become sort of, in the case of that one, it's an internal issue, right? How does the Papua New Guinea Security Armed Forces manage that, or the local security forces? How do they manage that, right? The part that we have the capacity to inform and educate on those things.
Okay.
But how does the 3rd Marines, when they go out there to try to provide helicopter assistance, and now they're operating in that space, right? Is there an awareness that there's a security environment around here that isn't or may not be completely peaceful, right? And how do you manage and think about that, right? Well, that's the uniqueness of disasters. I mean, there's probably been 50 or 60 U.S. military disaster responses, in the Pacific in the last few decades.
Yeah.
Right? Every single one of them is different. It's as big as Nepal and Typhoon Haiyan in 2015, 2013, all the way to the Thai cave rescue. Saving a soccer team, helping to save a soccer team, from a submerged, cave entrapment. So the answer, James, as you might imagine, is it depends.
Fair enough, it does. So I think you're spot on. So let's then pull from that and let's talk about success then.
Sure.
And so we've seen multinational cooperation work. Pacific Partnership in the Philippines is a good example. I think your teams have involved in that frequently. So let me ask you the question then. So from CFE's perspective, from your vantage point as trainers, observers, partners, what were the friction points that had to be actively managed in order to turn cooperation into real outcomes? And so I asked that question about friction points really because they're going to be present in all of these things. And we've got disaster managers that are listening and things, and we got to think about these things in advance. And so by looking back at some of the things they happen, not critically necessary, but just recognizing, what would you offer that some of the learning things from some of those friction points? And I could name some off, but I'll leave it to you.
As most of the engagement sort of training opportunities that we provide is try to emphasize to those people who are providing assistance. And I'll start there, right? So the people who want to be of assistance in a given environment, right? It's understanding that is the affected state, right? Like you're trying to help a sovereign nation to fix things, right? They are already in distress because something horrible happened.
That's right.
Right? There's predictions in places like Northern California and Washington State where, if the Cascadia fault line goes off, half of the disaster responders will either be dead or not come to work. So what do you do when it's your country? Now you've lost capacity. And this happened in Nepal, where basically the leadership in the government was disabled effectively for a few days. The Nepal Armed Forces sort of stepped up until they came in. How do you manage that friction when you're trying to bring things in, and it is a friction-filled environment by design, full of uncertainty and other things? Well, I would say, in all honesty, is don't be the typical American, right? Don't be the typical, oh, I know how to do this, let me help you. It's like, no, no, no. What do you need? Who are the people that you use to work with? And you build this through, as we talked about earlier, those relationships. Yeah. If you think through the Pacific Islands, for example, right? Many of the Pacific Islands are highly prone for disasters, right? So Vanuatu is a good example. Lots of earthquakes, lots of things can affect them. Well, Vanuatu has established relationships, right? Long and time relationships, with Australia, right? And growing relationships with the United States and other things within the Pacific Island community and the rest of this. Well, how do they respond? Well, they respond based on who they're used to talking to and the risks and the hazards and the things that they need. And that generates friction, but the other type of friction is now the U.S. is going to come in and try and do something, right? And Australia is going to come in and try and do something. And now there's another sort of collective called the Pacific Response Group. Now the PRG, which was actually led by Australia, is going to come in and try and do things. Well, how does Vanuatu adapt to that, right? Well, you do it through training, exercise, things like Pacific Partnership. We did Pacific Partnership stops there twice in the last 2 cycles to try to help their NDMO to understand here's how the integration of foreign military forces, because Vanuatu doesn't have a military, right? There's no counterpart to the 3rd Marines to go in and say, hey, let me talk to your commanding general. And it's like, hey, that's the cop, and he's sitting over there, and I'm not saying you're scaring him, but relax a little bit. Right. So it is practice. It's exercising. It really is some of the dialogue things and getting to see people on the margins of different meetings and different engagement opportunities. There's a whole host of regional engagement programs across the Pacific that almost all of those folks are involved in, and that really helps a lot.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I could see even in examples like that where information is extremely valuable, and yet if you're trying to look like you have all your stuff together, you probably are careful of the information that gets leaked out or gets spread. And so even as something as simple as that would be a friction point. And what do you need that information for? Or you kind of spoke about, in the military we speak about this unity of command, and maybe you're really talking about a unity of purpose. We're all moving in the right direction. Let's talk about strategy. Disaster response clearly has strategic effects. We're talking about credibility, access, long-term relationships. These are, without a doubt, effects that we get. Here's the question. How should leaders think about humanitarian assistance strategically without turning it into into geopolitics by another name? Right. We really keep it focused on what it is focused on.
That's a great question. It kind of reminds me, I've heard somebody use this phrase before, which is, 2 things can be true at the same time.
That's fair.
Right? And recently I've been doing a lot of maybe research, maybe pondering, I don't know what the right word is, thinking about, and maybe it's 3 things can be true at the same time, right? So the first is, I can have a truly altruistic desire to help you in your time of need. I can do that, right? And the U.S. does that a lot, right? A significant number of disasters last year, significant military presence in the Philippines, I think 2 or 3 times, and a couple other places. The fact is that there is a genuine desire to help people, and you can do that, right? And it can also be true that the Philippines are an important ally and partner, and that helping them helps that relationship, and not helping them would hurt that relationship. That can be true and still do necessary things for the affected population and the people in need, and to actually, in this case, move food packs to different places that couldn't get to it, or access some of the northern islands that were having difficulty based on cyclonic activity and the rest of that. Those both things can be true. And then a third one that kind of popped in to my head is, and it can also be true that I'm doing this because it's good for you, right? If I help you as a country to get back on your feet, right? And this is like an economics kind of discussion. If I can help you get back on your feet and recover faster, right? Then you go back to normal quicker, right? You go back to normal economic development sooner, you go back to economic growth sooner, and sometimes those economic things matter, right? Because now you've taken somebody who maybe used to be dependent on either economic assistance or some other kind of aid. You say, hey, let's help build your economic conditions up to such a point that you don't need that. Because then if a disaster does happen, I can get you back to that. You become completely, sovereign, independent, pick a word, it doesn't matter. So I think all three of those things can be true at the same time, and they don't have to cross streams. You don't have to, throw the word out there, so we're only helping them because they're our friends. It's like, no, they're our friends and we're helping them.
Yeah.
Those can both be true.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if we took this to a more personal level, if we had a disaster hit the island, there's going to be a lot of need here, but I'm probably going to start with my own street
Right.
and the people that I have a relationship with, which is exactly what you're saying.
Right.
And because that's what neighbors do. We reach out. No, I like that. The first 72 hours is like the golden hours
Right.
or something. I mean, this is when it's when plans meet reality and things break, and without a doubt, there's just a lot of chaos going on. You're trying to figure out the situation. You're trying to get things together, and it is most critical at the same time. And so, in those first 72 hours after a major disaster strikes, where do you most often see the decisive frictions in coordination and information and logistics and leaderships? And then why is that? And I guess the reason I'm asking is because if this is where these things are going to happen, we should be thinking about those things in advance, right? Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
So clearly, obviously, the first 72 hours in any major disaster, right? So a lens from the inside,
yeah,
right? As you described in your neighborhood, something bad happens in my neighborhood, right? First question I have is, okay, when is this bad thing going to stop, right? So if it's an earthquake, it's going to stop pretty fast. If it's a cyclone, it could be going on for a while, whatever it is, if it's a fire. But the fact, when is this thing going to stop? And then what was the damage, right? Yeah. What's going on around me? And then what resources do I have to address that? And then the outside, maybe the next neighborhood over is like, hey, how can we help these guys? Well, you don't know what they need, right? But they don't know what they have because maybe they're out of power, they're they have no information, et cetera. So it really is that point on, if you're inside the disaster, it's how do you assist a country to understand what is going on, right? Can you help them to build assessment mechanisms by which at the local level they can report things up, and so then the provincial level or the district level or the regional or national level has an understanding of what is going on in each place, because understanding where bad things have happened is key to how do you provide the right assistance in certain places, right? Because if I've got 10 boxes of food, and 10 places to send it to, but 5 of them don't actually need it. Yep. So instead of everybody getting one, now the people actually need to get 2. I mean, that's a very simplified example, right? So then now I'm an outside agency and I want to provide assistance, and I got a big heart and I got some big resources maybe I'm a big organization, right? Like the UN or even the US military in certain aspects. And I want to provide assistance. Well, what do you send? Right? In some cases it's, well, I send what I got. Yeah. It's like, but what you got isn't what they need. So how do you match those two? And so there's a requirements meeting needs sort of capacity in those first 72 hours that is important to set up, because you got to figure out what's needed, right? Which comes from the local disaster affected folks. And then you sort of, how do you source and accommodate that and then make these things happen? And it's a very, very difficult time, which at the local level that's their most important task, is figuring out what do I need and relaying it. Sometimes it's, I don't need anything. We're good. Which means that those resources can then be applied someplace else.
I spent years working the Afghanistan problem, and I recall very distinctly and very close up the results of providing too much stuff, and it takes up space, and it's in warehouses, and it's not the things you need. And so your point was, understanding what is required because sending the wrong stuff, or it can really have a detrimental effect on it, and you're not helping. In fact, it's worse than not helping, you're hurting. No, there's a lot of things to think about.
Yeah, sometimes they call that the disaster after the disaster, right? And I'm going to pick on Indo-Pacific for a while. Back then, PACOM. So in 2013, Typhoon Haiyan went through the Philippines. I was the J9. I'm watching this from the outside. I hadn't moved to CFE yet. And God bless them, right? Somebody said, hey, we're going to do a clothing drive, right? So they're going to bring boxes in. They're going to collect clothing. They send it to Tacloban, or they're going to send it to someplace else in the Philippines, right? That's like the worst thing imaginable that you can do. But they did it. They did it because their heart was pure, right? These people are going to need clothes. Yeah. It's like, yeah, but they don't need winter jackets and ski boots because that's what people in Hawaii get rid of, right? They don't get rid of like kids' diapers, right? And things like that. So there becomes that disaster after disaster is one thing, but it really does become, and that's, I guess, the benefit of being a logistician growing up, is that understanding that part of the humanitarian, environment was super easy for me. I mean, that was like second nature, because I had a lifetime of war planning for logistics, and then going and doing it in certain places, and everything you just described, we all know as military guys, happens.
And I had very caring action officers that thought they were doing the right thing, and they were clogging up the system.
Send money, right? I mean, it's as simple as that. Find a local relevant charity, and if not, the Red Cross, Red Crescent societies globally are very well managed and actually reach specifically into those communities through sort of the Red Network to do those things. So it's pretty amazing. If I was going to cheap plug for those guys.
No, you're absolutely right. I want to pull further on this community, this local factor.
Sure.
And we have talked even here, and we often do about, the big militaries, the international agencies. But the first responders are always the local communities. These are the ones that are immediately getting after it. And so how does CFE then ensure that this international planning support that we're going to provide, that they're not steamrolling over the local community, they're buttressing, they're helping? You must address that in some of your efforts that you spoke about.
So the best description I can give to you is there's this really cool chart that we have, and I'll try and give you a little visual representation, right? So a disaster occurs, right? And it's the local community doing what they can. But the disaster is worse than that. So now the outside community's got to help them. And then eventually, and maybe quickly, we need outside assistance from outside of our country. And that can be foreign military assistance or the international humanitarian community or others. So at some point on the top of this things got really bad chart is when the U.S. would get there. And that's because this capacity is exceeded, and now you need this. 2018, 2019, the region in particular started to look at a concept called localization. And localization was what you just described, which is how do we enable those local communities to take care of themselves so it never gets to that point. There was doctrine, there was documents, there was exercises, there were workshops that talked about it. And then what we found in COVID, right, was that now you had to do it.
Yeah.
Because the countries literally wouldn't let people in. Like if you're not there, you're not going into Micronesia, or you're not going into these places because they shut it down, which means now those local NGOs, those non-governmental organizations or civil society organizations, or maybe even the big international organizations, if they're there, right, that's it. What you got is what you got. And I think the lesson from that is that these local organizations are incredibly capable, and nobody understands the problem set better than they do. Why? Because they're there before the disaster, they're during the disaster, and they're after the disaster. Typical military response, like a U.S. military response, is 3 to 4 weeks maybe, that we're in quick and we're out quick. And that's because that's not really what we're supposed to be doing from our readiness perspective. But those humanitarian organizations that are there, or church groups, or whatever it is, that's the enabling capacity. And we actually teach that and have done, like one of our best practices handbooks talks about localization, so that people who think about this or in this industry or in this business can go, oh, I should probably pay attention to the guys that are on the ground. And so that's kind of the current status of that.
You made me reflect a little bit. So this was early 2020, January, February, and then we finished in March. But we here at the center, we had a comprehensive crisis management course. And of course, you'll note that that's the period that COVID occurs and we start locking down. And so we've got crisis managers here from around the region and frankly beyond. And I distinctly remember having discussions with them about actions that would be taken on the ground and stuff. This was before it became real. I mean, they left out of here probably within a week of all shutdown, right? That's how proximate it was. And so truly, we've had some real tests of our ability to do this, and we have gotten better and learned a lot. But these are real difficult, trying times. So as we think of this, maybe I'll ask you for some hard advice. So you have the year of all the, let's say you have the year of all the defense ministers here in the Indo-Pacific. What are important steps that they should take now to build resilience, not just reaction?
I would say it's an unfair question.
Fair.
Right? Well, the reason it's unfair is that, depending on how you count it, there's 34, 36, 38 different countries in the Pacific, right? In the Pacific Islands, for example, only 5 of them have militaries, right? But across Southeast Asia and South Asia and others, most of them have a military. I've actually had a chance to speak at the Chief of Defense Conference a couple of times. I've met lots of the Chiefs of Defense, and we've actually had hard questions. First couple times I met General Bronner out of the Philippines.
Yep.
It wasn't a pleasant experience for some people in the room because he was super mad about the way that disaster response and the military civil integration was occurring in the Philippines. Now, he's fixed it in the last 3 years, but the reality is that each country, the answer is it depends, right? So I'll use Indonesia, for example. Indonesia, massive country, tons and tons of people, 17,000 islands spread all over the place. It's basically the Walmart of disasters, right? They've always got a lot of stuff. They're going on 25 legitimate disasters going on every single day in Indonesia, right? Like right now, right? Between volcanoes and flooding and everything else. Well, how does TNI, their military, interact with their civilian agencies in providing support to that? And the answer generally is it's location specific and disaster specific, right? And in this case of Indonesia, the TNI's roles and responsibilities as part of the disaster response mechanism for the government of Indonesia is pretty robust, right? In other places, it's not, right? The U.S. military, generally speaking, doesn't respond to disasters in disasters in the United States because we have robust civilian agencies and the rest of this. Other countries, Bangladesh, for example, it's the primary disaster response force. So I would tell the Chief of Defense in Bangladesh, sir, you have a super hard job, right? And if you're not thinking about things like what happens if a cyclone goes through Cox's Bazar? What do you do with a million, non-citizens who are now not only non-citizens but horribly displaced in a catastrophic disaster in a country with 165 million of its own people, right? And so what I would say to each of them is figure out what the risks and hazards are in your country as specifically as possible. Like what is going to happen to this community? And then second would be, and how is that going to affect your installations, right? What happens if a cyclone goes through this naval base, or if an earthquake affects this airfield that you had planned to do stuff from? And I believe that most of them do that. I do believe that is part of their process. But in some places, and we'll go back to Papua New Guinea, that is a military that has a significant amount of other challenges that it's trying to deal with and maybe can't get to that same level of resolution in some of those risks and hazards, right? Well, maybe that's a place where others could help, right? Maybe that's a place where my organization, for example, could be of assistance to provide an assessment of disaster response capacity for those locations. We're in the process of doing that right now for Micronesia. And they're going to provide a country-by-country assessment to Joint Task Force Micronesia as they look at what could the possible U.S. responsibilities be and what is the likelihood of disasters in these places and what is the capacity of those 3 different nations to respond. So that they can, because basically the U.S. military is the military for Palau, Marshall Islands, and Micronesia, is how would they then be best postured to do that? So instead of waiting until it happens, it's, hey, let's think about this in advance, God forbid. So.
Yeah. No, I like to think that we're now seeing such a rapidity of these types of crises that they're now no longer black swan events. I mean, they're just coming in flocks. They're just, it's not if it's going to happen. It's like you said, in Indonesia, it's happening every day.
Yep.
I think it was in 2024, the Philippines in the span of a month had 6 typhoons that went through, and you would know better than I, since I'm sure your team was engaged in all of that, and no doubt that's General Bronner. A lot of upsetness was, probably in there. He was here at the center recently. Sat down with him. Wonderful gentleman, but I imagine when things are going sideways, there's reason to grab people by the short hairs and try to get things right. Let me ask you one more question before we go off to audience questions. And this one I'll ask you, I think, in the long view. So 10 years from now, you've been doing this 12 years. So 10 years from now, what do you hope will have changed about disaster preparedness and responses in the region?
I guess I can answer that question by going 10 years back,
Yeah.
right? When I look at, for example, the response capacity of the Philippines, the response capacity of Indonesia specifically, significant changes there, Vietnam and other places where they have really moved to a point of incredible self-reliance and capacity, right? The Black Swan, the really significant event, anybody would need help in. But generally speaking, many nations have moved to a point of much higher resilience and their capacity to bounce back after disasters. I think there'll be even more, right? I think that some of the economically developing nations will continue to grow in that space. And as they do, they will then seek ways to look, how do we help outside, right? So I really hope that 10 years from now, for example, that the Philippine Armed Forces has a recognized capacity to go out and provide assistance in other places. They do it, but is it to the level of expertise that they want, right? And part of that is because, neighbors taking care of neighbors, right? And the whole ASEAN design, right? I take care of, one ASEAN, one response. Well, if we can get to that point, then the U.S. may be able to free up its resources to go do other things, right? So I think that 10 years from now that many places will be better off. I personally don't think that we'll experience necessarily that many more disasters because we're already the most disaster-prone place in the world. A 10% increase from being number one, you're still number one.
This is true.
Right? So I'm hoping that, and then I really hope that within sort of some of these regional mechanisms that as they develop, I mentioned the Pacific Response Group dealing primarily in the Pacific, the South Pacific Islands. I think that as it continues to develop its capacity, you may have a mechanism down there in which you don't have to worry about it, right? And certainly I think the opportunities exist in South Asia to do the same thing. ASEAN has it pretty much for the most part. I think that some of those regional capacities would be very useful.
Brilliant. Well, let's turn to audience questions. We have quite a few, and so let's go through some of them.
Sure.
And so this first one's asking about your toughest moment. And so what's been one of the most challenging moments you've faced during a response, and what did it teach you about leadership under pressure?
So as I mentioned,
Yeah.
I did not grow up being a disaster response person.
Yeah.
A lot of people in the enterprise were actually first responders in different places and the rest of that. So I'll give you a couple of examples of things that happened to me that taught me a lot of lessons. So in 2006, I was in Iraq, and an awful lot of missiles were flying in an awful lot of different places. And that was the first time as a commander that I had responsibility for us during a missile attack. And everything that I did was just from memory. It was from practice. It was from rehearsing over and over and over again. I knew how to do accountability. I knew how to keep track of people. I knew how to report medical issues. I knew how to do these things because we had done it a lot, right? So the lesson was, again, it better not be the first time you do something, better not be the first time you thought about it. Yeah. So that's the lesson to others is if you're not sure, then practice, right? Find those opportunities, engage in those exercises, and do those things and make them hard, right? So.
No, you're spot on. It's kind of like the plan is nothing, but planning is everything. And so we got to think about these things. This next question is asking about risk communication. So in disasters, how should leaders communicate risk to earn trust and cooperation?
So that's very, very difficult right now. Yeah. And I would say because the presence and proliferation of disinformation and misinformation and the accessibility of bad information, whether it's intentional or not, can sway the way that populations think about things, right? So as a disaster response manager, for example, you've got to get out information to folks. They've got to trust that the information that they're getting from you is legit and actionable, right? Well, that's relationships, that's practice, that's being open and honest. And you also have to have the ability, because nefarious players are out there and they do this, and they do it all the time, right? Either on the political spectrum or geopolitics or whatever. This says, I'm going to try and sway the way that people think about this government or this person or whatever by putting bad stuff out there. And it's to the point that we actually generated a course on crisis communications and disasters.
Say more.
And I went down to the Philippines in November. We actually taught this to the interagency in the Philippines. We've taught it, I think, probably 6 or 8 times now. We taught it in ASEAN, taught it in Singapore, taught it, I think, twice in Taiwan. And the idea being, if you as a disaster manager, an information manager, whatever you want to call yourself, don't get the right message out, then you're not going to get the response back that you need, and you can save lives, right? You can prevent damage. You can do the rest of these things by get information out, and there is a counter current to that in some places is super bad. In some places it's unintentional, like somebody just posts something and doesn't realize that what they sent was wrong. Two people see a car accident, right? Yep. But from different angles, whose fault was it? Well, that happens too in passing information out. So
I wish I could remember the name of it. I watched a Netflix movie recently, your story about passing out information. This island on the top of the mountain fell off, went into the ocean, caused a great tsunami, and killed nearly everybody on the island. But the team, leadership team, had some information. And there were some that were hesitant to pass it out for fear it might not be totally accurate. And the other guys were like, this may save somebody. And it ended up saving a number of somebodies because information is super important to people that are on the ground and in the middle of crisis. This next question is asking about Red Cross, Red Crescent coordination. And so how do you tell when civil military coordination with neutral actors is really working?
So take our course. We'll teach you all about it.
But
if you don't have time for the course.
And we do actually send people to your course. A number of our people have been out there, so you do a good job. Yeah.
So the spectrum that they talk about oftentimes is collaboration, right, which is a friendly environment in which we all get along. And it's pretty easy in those cases to talk to the Red Crescent, Red Cross societies, the UN and others, because so think natural disasters, right? You're all there to do a great thing. On the opposite end of the spectrum would be conflict, and then it's basically coexistence, right? You're in the same space, but you're not going to collaborate with each other because their humanitarian and particularly their independence and neutrality would be at risk if they get caught in a meeting with you, right? So in a conflict environment, it's easy to keep it separated because you're forced to, right? In a natural disaster environment, it's easy because you can freely talk to each other. It's in that space in the middle in which, hey, are we working together on this? There's also a different dynamic with the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement in particular, because as a national federation, right? So you probably know this, but national societies, I think there's 193, 194 of them, right? Then there's a federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent societies. So the national, agencies take care of those countries. In some countries, they have a by-law responsibility to be an auxiliary to the government to provide assistance. Well, you better work with them because that's their job. Right? And then the IFRC and others can bring in resources. So it's taught in some of the classes, sort of the blue pillar, which is the UN community, the red pillar, which is the Red Cross, Red Crescent societies, and then the purple pillar, which is kind of everybody else that does this. All those people have the same intent, and then there's this necessity for collaboration amongst them. And if you're a military force, understanding that difference matters. Right? So a U.S. military force going into a foreign country to provide assistance runs into a guy from the Red Cross. You better know what that means.
Yes. That's right.
So.
No, thank you for that. So let me move, we're running low on time, but let me ask you this question. This is asking about the U.S. Coast Guard and HADR. So from a coordination standpoint, how does the U.S. Coast Guard fit into rapid response in the Indo-Pacific?
So in the Indo-Pacific, I can give you a pretty good idea. So they have a huge presence. So the PAC area is located in California. They sort of run the whole region, and it's well beyond the Indo-PACOM AOR, but ships out there all the time. So if a disaster occurs in the Pacific, at Indo-PACOM, for example, there's a staff up there, and they will look at, hey, give me a positioning of forces. Tell me where everybody is, which includes, in that case, the Coast Guard. So the Coast Guard will identify to the military command structure at PACOM, here's the resources that are in the theater. Now, they have another reporting chain through Homeland Security in which they can move to the sound of gunfire just like everybody else, to the sound of a disaster, right? They have different authorities, but the fact is they are a response force in the Pacific, and oftentimes are the closest ones there, particularly when you think about the Pacific Islands and some of the more outward places. So they're an active participant in it. I talked to Admiral Bozzella, who's the commander out at PAC area, and they do a terrific job in being able to support the command and disaster responses. Eventually, it all comes kind of merging together into a U.S. response because they would be a component to an extent, the DoD could be a component to an extent, and then those civilian assets that could be provided through the State Department and other places, either resources or physical assets, could also all be integrated into a single response in a single location.
Wonderful. This next one's asking about multinational coordination. So how does CFE work with MNF SOP, so multinational forces standard operating procedures, and Singapore's Changi Regional HADR Coordination Center? You spoke about that earlier.
Right.
So how do they do that to support multinational HADR coordination?
So the MNF SOP, which you talked about, if you get a chance to read it, it's awesome. It's probably 1,400 pages.
I have seen it. It's rather large.
It'll hurt your brain.
Yep.
A component to that is how do you do multinational coordination in natural disasters? So the Changi Center hosts an exercise every 2 years called CORES. We've been an integral part of that since it started, in which you actually teach, and the term of art is a multinational coordination center, or in some countries it's called a multinational military coordination center. And it's a capacity for a nation to bring military forces in, give them someplace logical to function from, and then provide assistance. So the MNF SOP provides some of the narrative or some of the words. The Temps Express series of exercises hosted by PACOM gives an opportunity to practice that. And then each country determines if it wants to have one of these enterprises or not. And then they can practice it or stand it up during exercises. So the Philippines have them for sure, Indonesia, and we're in the process now of helping Taiwan to develop an MNMCC, so that in the event of a natural disaster in which resources come in that they need to integrate in, that they actually have a mechanism to do that.
I want to ask you one more question. So this question's asking about simultaneous demands. So how should planners manage disaster response when multiple regional demands are colliding? All these things coming together. How do you manage it?
I don't have a good answer to that because it's so situation dependent. I can give you an example though. So very recently there was the cyclone, two cyclones that went through the Philippines, right? So the 3rd Marines out of Okinawa were intimately involved in that. Lots of organizations were involved, but the Marines stood up a special MAGTF to kind of run the command and control for that, and it went very well. Shortly thereafter, massive flooding in Sri Lanka, right? So it goes back to my comment earlier. Well, what forces are available in the area? How quickly can they get there, and what can they do? Well, Sri Lanka, in the Bay of Bengal is a very different location to try to get to in that space than the Philippines, right? Very few forward U.S. presidents passed Singapore into that area. So there was a dynamic at the headquarters and other places that says how and what should be provided and how quickly can it get there. And then that kind of goes almost, that's the sending state side. Now how does Sri Lanka look at it, right? Okay, well I can get assistance from these guys or these guys or these guys or these guys, or maybe all four. Do I set up some kind of an integration function for all of them? So the competing demand signals, the competing resources is very real in these things. And I'll also couch that with, and every time the U.S. military deploys forces to go do something, it is not doing its primary wartime training mission.
That's fair.
It's doing good deeds, doing good work, doing important stuff, right? Grown adults make important decisions to do those things. And when they do, we excel at it. But the reality is that a person can't train for conflict and also be doing disaster response at the same time. Some skills cross over, right? Helicopter operations, airfield operations, some of those things are a great training environment actually. But is there a cost to readiness? And I think people look at that as they make decisions to support or not.
Yeah, there are real tensions out there. So before I close this, I like to ask about recommendations. I wonder if you might have one for the audience.
So have a couple. Start with the Bible or whatever book gives you faith, right?
Faith is a good one to pull.
So I would start with that. That gives you peace, it gives you understanding in a space that's much bigger than you. But I had a good friend of mine who were arguing about, like how do people think, or what is the current state of U.S. Policy in different areas? And basically I looked at him and I was like, dude, have you read the unclassified national defense strategy that just got released? Have you read the new State Department products that have been released? If you want to know why my organization behaves the way that it does and supports the things it does, it's because it's in those documents. If you want to know how the U.S. thinks and cares about economic development or trade or whatever, read those, because it will give you perhaps a view on how we view defense and how we view security and how we view those things that maybe, and they're not long, right? It's not like I'm asking you to read 20, 30 pages each usually.
That's right.
And in the current style of writing out of this administration, very clear.
Very transparent.
Pristinely clear. And I would say if it's written there, That is what you ought to pay attention to.
Joe, this has been like a masterclass talking on disaster management. I really appreciate you coming in and taking this time with me in the audience, so thank you so very much.
James, I appreciate it very much.
Yeah,
thank you.
absolutely.
It's been a pleasure.
As we conclude today's dialogue, this conversation reminds us that disaster response in the Indo-Pacific is not just about speed or scale. It's about preparation, partnerships, and leadership under pressure. Resilience isn't improvised in crisis, it's built long before the storm arrives. These conversations shape security. On behalf of all of us at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, thank you for being part of this important dialogue. Many thanks to Joe Martin for joining us. I'm James Minnick, and until we meet again, aloha. The opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of War, or the U.S. government.